Don't steal what God wants to give you. So there's this theme in the Bible. People don't like to wait. I mean, I know I don't. One Christmas, I snuck downstairs at 7 in the morning and I found a present. And I opened it and it was a bike helmet. I was thrilled, even though at that point, I didn't quite have a bike. Waiting is hard, and waiting when God has promised us something wonderful is even harder. The book of Genesis tells us of a couple named Abraham and Sarah who had to wait for a promise from God. God had promised Abraham that he'd make him into a great nation. He would make his descendants like the dust of the earth, too numerous to count. This was a huge deal, but there was one problem. Abraham and Sarah were already 75 years old when they got this promise from God. And even worse, they didn't have a kid. In fact, Sarah was barren. And as time went on, Abraham began to get worried. How is God going to make his descendants too numerous to count if he didn't even have one? And eventually, Abraham complains to God. He's worried that one of his servants is going to end up inheriting his household if he doesn't have a kid. But God reassures him. And this time he tells him that he's going to make his descendants like the stars, too numerous to count. And so time goes on. And eventually, Abraham's wife, Sarah, begins to get worried too. She feels bad. She feels like she's ruining God's plan. And so she comes up with an idea. She takes one of her servants, Hagar, and she tells Abraham to have a baby with her. And instead of trusting in God, Abraham goes into her. Genesis 16. Genesis 16:4. And he went into Hagar. It's right here. It's supposed to be a family show, but okay, God. Abraham doubts that God is going to make good on his promise, and so he gets Hagar pregnant. And this causes all kinds of drama. Sarah feels mistreated, so she mistreats Hagar, and Hagar eventually runs away. And some people even believe that this is the event that started all the disunity and unrest that we see in the Middle East today. And as Abraham and Sarah learn, all this could have been avoided if they had just trusted in God's faithfulness. Sarah eventually does have a boy named Isaac. And God, through Isaac, makes Abraham into a great nation. He makes good on his promise, and he protects Abraham's line all the way down until a baby boy is born in a stable in Bethlehem. Don't steal what God wants to give you. He is faithful, but we have such a hard time believing this. How often do we doubt God's promises? We doubt whether he's as good as he says he is. But this story tells us that when we take shortcuts to get to God's promises, we end up hurting ourselves and others. Abraham and Sarah had to wait 25 years to see God come through, and you might have to wait even longer. But from the story, we can learn that we don't need to worry. God is faithful. Now, maybe you've already taken shortcuts to God's promises. You've tried to do things your own way, and the results sucked. But there's hope for you as well. The story of Abraham and Hagar is not only a story of mistakes, it's also a story of redemption. God promised to make Abraham into a great nation, and he does this through the line of Isaac. But he also does this through Hagar's son, Ishmael. Ishmael's people eventually go on to become the Arabians. And thousands of years later, when the Apostle Paul is spreading the gospel, he comes in contact with the Arabian people, and they become some of the earliest Christians. God uses Abraham and Hagar's mistake for his good. Romans 8:28 tells us, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. God will use the mistakes you've made for good. We serve a God who is faithful even when we're not. Trust that he will come through on his promises.